Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of the Inner Realm podcast. And today I'm going to read out guiding axiom number 5, which is a part of this sub-series that I've been doing, where I've been reading out these axioms that I wrote for my newsletter, The Unhappy Man. Links down below in the description. And as I was writing down these axioms, I realized I'm in fact setting up a framework for... Sounds like someone just got shot outside. That's fine. We don't live in America. This is Australia. People don't get shot here. Getting back to it, when I was laying down these axioms, I realized that, this is a framework for all of my creative work. Therefore, it only makes sense to read them out in this podcast, given that this podcast is a part of my creative work. I'm sorry if that sounds pretentious. And also, it allows me to have a bit of structured thinking, and writing, I think, is the best way to do that. Today's axiom number 5, is undoubtedly my favorite one. It's never fall in love with your suffering, I said never fall in love with suffering as a category. And the reason it's important for me is because from all the axioms I've laid down, in many ways, these axioms are an antidote to my flaws or things that I see are shortcomings in my character, be it morally, spiritually, existentially, whatever you want to call it. And that's why I'm writing down this axiom, so that I don't let these shortcomings in my character of who I am as a person impact the work I do. And falling in love with suffering, my God, I'm kind of ashamed how vain it is when I really understood this concept. Thanks a lot to Slavoj Žižek. I think it's reading his stuff and listening to his lectures that really influenced me as to why it's a bad idea to fall in love with suffering, and most of us subconsciously or unconsciously do this. Therefore, it's important to be cognizant of this phenomena. Without further ado, enough of a prelude. Let's get to the axiom. So yes, as I said, it's The Unhappy Man, guiding axiom number 5, never fall in love with suffering. And of course, I've got this painting by Goya. This is an interesting one of Christ crucified. This is before, I think, he went through his phase of depression. But of course, suffering is very much connected to the archetypal story of the Western collective unconscious, let's say, of the crucifixion. That's why I decided to pick this. Any Kierkegaardian is familiar with the captivating admission in either rule. My melancholy is the most faithful mistress I have known. What wonder, then, that I love her in return? Most of us of the existentialist ilk have fully bought into the dogma of the depressed yet perspicacious philosopher. For us, all great truths lack profundity if not written in a Schopenhauerian pessimism about our condition. The misery of existence is what those with great intelligence and deep hearts have come to see. To not see this verity is nothing but naivety. At least this is the bullshit we tell ourselves. To be depressed or suffer needlessly is far from the romantic beauty we give to it. None of it makes one's soul deeper and inspires philosophically penetrating poetry or Dostoevskian literature. In fact, when I read my nonsensical journaling, written during the low points, I see it as nothing but vain, egotistical pabulum, which is why I stopped journaling. It's a waste of time, and better drinking away your sorrows. This is a joke. Footnote. But beyond ostentatious vanity, we all dwell with our misery purely to feel something. We often deliberately seek pathological relationships only because the melodramatic pain of love reminds us of our humanness. Better to feel pain than nothing at all. Or as Dostoevsky wrote, if he, human beings, does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos, will contrive suffering of all sorts, only to gain his point. Notes from Underground. And of course, being willing to suffer through love, particularly romantic, tells us of our goodness, of our higher virtues in being authentically self-sacrificial for another. Such is why Nietzsche wrote, ultimately it is the desire, not the desire, that we love, beyond good and evil. I must admit that I am ashamed of how pathetic we are as a species. Having said that, I see why modern people lust after suffering, as we are given the impossible choice of contrived pseudo-happiness in the form of New Age self-help, which you all know is rife with empty platitudes, i.e. bullshit, and the finger-wagging, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, heartless American stoicism. It seems that we're stuck in this binary. The modern age is an era of nihilism. So as Nietzsche, the man who explored the symptom to its ultimate wrote, read from a distant planet, the majuscule script of our earthly existence would perhaps seduce the reader to the conclusion that the earth was the ascetic planet par excellence, an outpost of discontented, arrogant, and nasty creatures who harbored a deep disgust for themselves, for the world, for all life, and hurt themselves as much as possible out of pleasure in hurting, probably their only pleasure. The passage above is from his scathing critique of the ascetic ideal. The mode of life he pillories has little to do with religious asceticism per se, but rather a cultural zeitgeist, despite the characteristic phenomenon being cross-cultural. For instance, he would be as equally contemptuous of the contemporary postmodern stoicism of the Ryan Holiday types or neoliberal Western Buddhism that turns a blind eye to the problems of the world and decides to inflict suffering on oneself for the pleasure of it, i.e. cold showers, fasting, CrossFit, etc. Irrespective of religious connotations, all such modes of being manifest a drive towards the ascetic ideal. So his sentiments are apt to any pseudo-suffering we create purely to inject artificial meaning into our barren, desolate veins. Whether in the form of modern self-help cults with their unending self-flagellation or a morbid romantic relationship that's conspicuously making everyone suffer, we desire meaning. Perhaps the intrinsic human reality is meaninglessness and the incompleteness of life. Therefore, we ought to be cognizant of how we respond to our predicament. And one can only live authentically once this datum is confronted. In my view, the only true antidote to meaninglessness or nihilism of our culture is love. But that's a whole other essay or book. Personal suffering. On suffering as a psychological phenomenon, I find affinity with the Zizekian sentiments on the matter. Footnote. Influenced by Jacques Lacan's concept of jouissance and the Freudian death drive, Zizek made the following point in his books and lectures, paraphrasing, "Don't fall in love with your suffering. Never presume that your suffering is in itself proof of your authenticity. Renunciation of pleasure can easily turn into pleasure of renunciation itself." Back to the essay. Pleasure never satiates us as there's only so much of it one can enjoy. Therefore, we seek the pleasure beyond pleasure and willfully suffer for an ostensibly nobler cause. But in reality, this is our yearning to fill the void in life. We hope to overcome the abyss with a deeper spiritual meaning, sometimes with a touch of romanticism as we see in fascism. That's elusive for us in the technological age. Footnote. Read the Question Concerning Technology essay by Martin Heidegger to understand what this age entails. When I mean this age, I mean the current age we live in, or the technological age to be more specific. I'll read that again. That's elusive for us in the technological age, where to Dostoevsky's dismay, man has become nothing but a piano key. Martyrdom, for instance, typifies this drive within us. Despite the word's etymology, a martyr is not a purely religious individual or some fundamentalist fanatic. To a certain extent, everyone sees themselves as a martyr, from a self-sacrificial parent, an assiduous employee working 15 hours a day at a trendy postmodern startup, to a nurse working in palliative care. To the martyr in us, the pain of sacrifice and duty gives us that pleasure when the so-called worldly pleasures, generally a derided term, but it shouldn't be, are inadequate. Footnote. Pleasure, which could be misunderstood by how it's colloquially used in the carnal, hedonic sense, may not be the aptest term for this instance, but I've decided to stick with it since I'm speaking in Freudian nomenclature. I'll reread that sentence because I feel jumping to the footnotes tend to break the flow of things, but I kind of have to read out the footnotes because they are related to what I'm writing. To the martyr in us, the pain of sacrifice and duty gives us that pleasure when the so-called worldly pleasures, generally a derided term, but it shouldn't be, are inadequate. Or as G.K. Chesterton wrote, pessimism is not in being tired of evil, but in being tired of good. Despair does not lie in being weary of suffering, but in being weary of joy, the everlasting man. Of course, none of this implies we shouldn't take upon actual responsibility in life and carry the world's burdens, nor does it mean, above all, that love is free of a sword and fire. Alain Bergeau observed, this is in his book In Praise of Love, by the way. It's a great little book that I've been recommending to many people. It's a lovely read. Reading that again, Alain Bergeau observed that our culture is atypically in trying to sell a safety-first concept of love. It is love comprehensively insured against all risks. You will have love, but will have assessed the prospective relationship so thoroughly, will have selected your partner so carefully by searching online, by obtaining, of course, a photo, details of his or her tastes, date of birth, horoscope signs, etc., and putting it all in the mix, you can tell yourself, this is a risk-free option. But he fights back against such safetyism. I'm convinced that love cannot be a gift given on the basis of a complete lack of risk. The Meetic, a French online dating service, approach reminds me of the propaganda of the American army when promoting the idea of smart bombs and zero dead wars in praise of love. So we ought to pick our battles and be cognizant of the difference between sacrifice for higher, life-sustaining ideals of love, justice, etc. that bring forth genuine good, and on the other hand, suffering for the love of suffering itself. The latter is nothing but vanity and exhibitionism. Any blind renunciation of pleasure and seeking of suffering becomes a kind of Machiavellian narcissism worse than what you'd see from a typical, more explicit Trump-like narcissist, as the former is the ultimate wolf in sheep's clothing. Ergo, as Zizek candidly tells us, never fall in love with your suffering. Suffering as a category. But I'd go a step further and assert, never fall in love with suffering as a category, period. Firstly, because it's simply unpragmatic. Suffering doesn't make anyone's life better and has no ennobling qualities in itself. Secondly, and more importantly, the fixation of suffering has imbued unspeakable amounts of evil. Case in point, I'm disgusted by how postmodern neoliberals, that's most of us, fetishize poverty. We implicitly believe there's some deep-found wisdom in the suffering of the poor, that those exploited in the maker mines in India for extortionate makeup products have a profundity to their souls that we degenerate Westerners have lost. Or we would salvatingly cite an outdated statistic about Bangladeshi people being happier than rich Americans. Footnote: who says happiness is the purpose of life, or that it's even something worth measuring? It doesn't matter that they're happier if the rapacious fashion industry allows for tragedies like the Rana Plaza collapse. In such moments, happiness is an unethical category. It's out of the question. But isn't all of this romanticization of poverty utter nonsense? Isn't it yet another example of the aforementioned suffering fetish, this time despicably manifested in the political domain? I doubt any of us unpretentiously listen to a poor person except through an ideological lens, which tells us what to hear over what the person's truly saying. Personally, whenever I've spoken to someone struggling to survive and barely making ends meet, I see nothing but despondency, pain, and resentment. Not the pristine goodness in the souls of poor folk would prescribe on them. Not the wisdom of the heart we'd read about in a Charles Dickens novel. Of course, Dickens knew this better than all of us. I partially blame the misappropriation of the crucifixion for the fetishism of suffering. I'm not surprised. As someone deeply enamored by Christ, the crucifixion is an infinite, suprahistorical event happening in the eternal now. Footnote. I borrow this term from Paul Tillich's book, The Eternal Now, which encapsulates most of his superlative theology. I highly recommend that book. He probably gives the best description of God that I've ever read in my life, and I think he's right. He's correct to describe God as the ground of all being. Back to the essay. Meditating on it has changed my life, or more accurately, given me a new one, and I shall expound on the matter in later essays. In any case, crucified Christ is only part of the Christian narrative, and we replace the whole with a fragment at great peril. We ought to never forget Christ also resurrected, as bizarre as that sounds. Notwithstanding one's religious beliefs, be it theist, atheist, or spiritual but not religious, all of us think of ourselves as a suffering Christ, carrying a cross. Footnote. To understand why, I recommend starting with Tom Holland's Dominion and Slavoj Žižek's Fragile Absolutes. Because as Don Cupid wrote, nobody in the West can be wholly non-Christian. You may call yourself non-Christian, but the dreams you dream are still Christian dreams. Since we, even migrants to the West like myself, dream in Christianity, we ought to never rush into glamorizing the suffering Christ and instead be searingly skeptical of our underlying humanistic intentions behind the veneer of self-sacrificial love. Perhaps Christ was thinking, my dad's a malevolent, sadomasochistic son of a bitch who's thrown me into gratuitous suffering because of a twisted, cosmic jurisprudential atonement he's conjured up ex nihilo. At least this is what theologians like William Lane Craig tell us. If Christ was the God-man, then for him to say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me, is an unsurprising remark for one to make while being crucified. And here, as Zizek points out, momentarily, God himself becomes an atheist. It's the negation and even hatred of God, e.g. Book of Job, that makes Christianity unique from any other religion and makes our culture outlandish. Footnote. Martin Scorsese's Silence explores this phenomenon well with the modern flavor of man's helpless frustration at God, and G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy encapsulates this idea best from any modern theology I've ever read. We see in Christianity the utmost palpable story of existence. Human suffering can be so unbearable that even God, once he comes down to us, realizes he cannot bear it and loses faith. Ergo, the separation from God is a part of divinity itself, and it's only the Christian God that knows the alienation of being human. I go on these detours only to explicate my view that suffering in itself has no higher soul-maturing virtue. We don't have to artificially create and fetishize it, as pain, tragedy, and unhappiness are already concomitant with the vicissitudes of life. So despite this newsletter being called The Unhappy Man, I shall never fall in love with unhappiness and suffering. If I ever do, I will stop writing. Thanks for watching. As I said, the link to this essay is down below in the description. If you do prefer reading it, please do check it out. But I shall see you in the next one. Cheers.